Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Nan Freund, and on behalf of the Association of Educational Therapists, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to part 2 of our webinar, Recognizing and Supporting Students with Nonverbal Learning Disorders. In part 1, Marion Marshall and Dianne Matthaei gave us an overview of the learning characteristics and challenges encountered by youngsters with nonverbal learning disorders, and pediatric occupational therapist Rebecca Schatz shared a wealth of information about the motor and sensory issues experienced by children with nonverbal learning disabilities, or learning disorders, and also interventions that mediate these issues. In today's webinar, Marion and Dianne will focus on reading, writing, and math interventions that are effective with these children. But before we begin, I want to share a little information about the Association of Educational Therapists. AET is the National Professional Association for Educational Therapists. AET sets standards and ethics for the professional practice of educational therapy and provides ongoing professional development for its members and the public. And now I'm delighted to introduce today's speakers once again. Marion Marshall comes to us from Oakland, California. She's a board-certified educational therapist, a fellow of the Association of Educational Therapists, and an associate professor at Holy Names University, where she's the director of the Educational Therapy Certificate Program. She's an award-winning educator who has taught in public and independent schools and has been an educational therapist for the past 20 years. She's a frequent presenter at regional, statewide, and national conferences. Dianne Matthaei is in Tacoma, Washington, where she too has been an educational therapist in private practice for the past 20 years. She served as a differentiated learning specialist and a teacher of mathematics. Her business, Lighthouse Learning LLC, provides assessment and instruction for atypical learners of all ages. As an educator, recognized for excellence in teaching, and the parent of 2 atypical learners, Dianne provides workshops for teachers, therapists, and parents alike. Dianne, Marion, and Rebecca are all contributors to the book, Treating NVLD in Children, Professional Collaborations for Positive Outcomes. Please welcome today, Marion and Dianne.
For those of you that were with us last time, I began talking a little bit about the first child I ever met with NVLD. As a professor who teaches courses for those to become educational therapists or to become educational specialists, mild and moderate, meaning special ed teachers, I knew the NVLD profile. I had it in my head because I teach classes about what is the history of special ed, what's special ed law, and what are eligibility kind of conditions. So I said last time that I had been asked to do a limited assessment with Jake. Jake is a pseudonym. And I knew that he was in the 3rd grade. He was highly verbal, but he was struggling with written language output, getting writing down on paper. And that was a confusing issue for teachers. And so I knew that when I first met him, that he had this stellar vocabulary and that he had just given me a theater-worthy, a theater critic-worthy description of the play, the adult play that he had seen the night before, for adults. And so we began our assessment, what I thought was going to be in a strength place for him. This is a plate from the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. This is the 4th edition. Jake and I did the 3rd edition. I thought that he was going to have a great time with this, and he did for the most part, because he knew a tremendous number of vocabulary words. Here is the first slide where I wondered what was going on. The Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, the examiner gives a word, and the student picks the picture that matches that word most closely. And here he said, without any hesitation, the word was isolation, and he chose number 2. isolation number 2. So I went on, and he continued to get most of the vocabulary words right, but every now and then there was another place like this where I wondered, what was he seeing that I wasn't seeing? And so at the end, I congratulated him on knowing so many vocabulary words, and I went back and I looked at a few slides. I snuck in the ones where he had done very well, and I asked him to talk about his thinking. How did he know it was such and such? And then I came to this one, and I said, so Jake, you were very clear that number 2 is the right answer for isolation. He said, absolutely, absolutely. And I said, could you explain your thinking to me? And he said, well, clearly the guy is in jail. I said, oh, how do you know he's in jail? And he said, look, there are bars on the window. So that was striking to me. And if you follow up from last time, the difficulty with visual perception, visual misconceptions is a hallmark of NVLD. Clearly, I don't see this guy in prison. The door is wide open. There's no prison guards. There's no prison garb. So, what's going on? Let's talk a little bit about the principles for support. And if you're a parent, I'm hoping that you will take away these principles and just think about it in terms of your own student or child. And if you're a specialist, a special education teacher or an educational therapist, you might take on some of these activities and some of these resources. First of all, these are my words. First of all, initially, teaching should not be multisensory. Wow. Every IEP, individualized education plan, or educational therapy intervention plan says teaching should be structured, well-sequenced, and multisensory. And yet for these students, there are difficulties integrating the verbal and the visual spatial information. So when you apply a lot of visual stimuli, you're actually overwhelming the student and making it difficult for him or her to learn. So increase the verbal instruction, try and decrease the visual stimuli. We all know to perform task analysis, because each individual, especially those with NVLD, have a unique array across those different domains of strengths and weaknesses. We're going to try and use evidence-based or research-based practices, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. It's important to instruct using 3D models or hands-on materials before using 2D or two-dimensional. Dianne will talk about this as the abstract continuum or the learning progression, and that's of course very appropriate, Dianne. And I'm going to talk about it just saying that it's important to use models, 3D models, probably longer than you normally would, and certainly maybe going back and using them for a child who is developmentally older than it might be thought that you should be using concrete models. Obviously, we're going to match instruction to learning strengths. And there may be at this point several specialists working with the child. So it's important for those specialists to communicate and to work together in concert. Certainly the home, the teacher, and maybe the specialist on board should really be thinking about who's doing what in what priority and how do we work together to support this student. A typical place for the first referral to an educational therapist is for written language disorders, as it was for Jake. Why? Well, there's a stark contrast between expressive language skills and written output. Here is a child who is remarkably verbal, great vocabulary, holds a great conversationalist, and yet written work is either limited or really a student is kind of balking at doing it. And so this messy work or lack of production could be viewed as willful, uncooperative, lazy, and sometimes even oppositional. Why won't this really verbal girl write? And Rebecca gave us some great examples of handwriting programs last time that really support all students, but particularly those with sensory processing issues. And I agree with all of those programs, but I want to think a little bit further that the difficulty with output sometimes, not completely, but sometimes has to do with the handwriting issues, the fact that motor skills and fine motor skills are not refined for these children, and that there are handwriting skills that are really based in fine motor skills and visual perceptual skills and the language therein. So let's see if I can get this right. I'm going to do a little exercise from the Handwriting Without Tears. This is actually a kindergarten. I'll do the kindergarten version where we're introducing students to how to form letters or numbers. All right, so down, let's see if I can do it. Down and over, down once more. That's the way you make a 4. Perfect. I know very many NVLD students who can do the rhyme perfectly, but can't match it to the motor movement, primarily because they haven't really intuited what down and over mean within their own bodies, or because they haven't been able to hold the mental image of what that 4 looks like. So if I'm the NVLD student, I might be doing this: down, over, down once more. And I end up with sort of this jagged zigzag thing, not a 4. Let's move quickly to some evidence-based practices. Well, first of all, there's not a great deal of literature specific to those with learning differences. There is some, and there's absolutely none. I looked very hard to find evidence-based practices for the students with NVLD. But I want to leave behind these next 4 bullets as resources for you. In the era of research-based, No Child Left Behind, it seemed it was very important to figure out what are effective practices. And the first was done by a national reading panel. Many experts looked at thousands of research studies that had looked at effective reading, trying to determine what is effective reading practices. And of those thousands, they first looked at what was the methodology and was it solid? Was it a good piece of research? And if not, it went over there. And if it was, they put it in the pile to compile what the research said. And so in this, you'll find a list of really effective practices. After that, 7 years later, came writing next. So let's examine reading practices. Now let's examine writing practices. What's effective there? Effective instruction for adolescents who are reading, 2008. And then later, 2010, the most recent one, says, what's the relationship between reading and writing, and or writing and reading? And I want to say that doing this research was very gratifying for me because I've been an ed therapist for 20 years and I've been a special ed teacher for 30 years. And so honing what works for most students with learning differences was embedded in this literature. It was very uplifting for me to see that the practices that I had moved towards and had been using successfully with students was actually listed in these research pieces. So let's talk more about the link between reading and writing. We all know that you first start out learning to read, and then later the phrase is you write to learn. But as a student gets older, it's very difficult to separate those two. If you have a middle schooler, a high schooler, and you're still trying to remediate reading comprehension, and you're separating writing instruction, you don't have time to do all of those things. So a very important study was done, and it's cited there, that says when you instruct in writing, using the texts that the student is using, it increases reading comprehension. I'll say that one more time. So when you are instructing in writing, but you're using the actual texts, so the English book, the novel that's being read, the social studies text, the science text, when you do that together, you're actually improving reading comprehension. Well, that makes sense, because in order to write about something, you really have to understand it. You have to really have something to say, and that increases the reading comprehension. And I think this is a powerful take-home message. So in order to write and learn, I call that cross-training with my students, because cross-training, in fact, turns out is a very efficient use of time. So we're just beginning to appreciate all the different aspects of executive functioning and how challenging that is for many students. But for those with NVLD, that's particularly an area of weakness. And yet writing really requires a great deal of executive functioning. So why are these very articulate students not able to be articulate when writing? Here they come. First of all, you have to plan. You have to plan about what you're going to write. And most of the planning techniques taught in classes are using graphic organizers or mind maps or something like that. And both of those are writing based. Well, if you have planned, you need to get started. And initiation is difficult for many of us. Think about it. We don't really like to do and get started on the things we're not particularly good at. So if you don't feel comfortable or confident, you're likely not going to initiate. If you haven't planned, you're really not going to initiate. And students with NVLD often have difficulty with staying on topic, and random kind of interesting ideas get inserted, so the writing turns out not to be well sequenced. There's not a formal term as topic maintenance, and the flow for the reader is kind of disjointed. Our group is drawn to novel or original ideas. Last time I said there were at least 4 places where the blur happens between students with NVLD and Asperger's, and this is probably a 5th. So this group is drawn to novel or original ideas and often will just write about that. And that may not be, usually isn't, what the teacher has assigned. Saliency, what's important, what to leave in, what to leave out. Well, if you're drawn to something novel and it's actually not germane, you're probably not dealing with very good saliency. How do you figure out what's important and what's not? NVLD students have a particular weakness in saliency determination. Everything seems to be of equal weight or of equal value, unless it's something they particularly are drawn towards, then that tops everything. And what surprised me in working with students with NVLD was they had issues with categorization. I really expected that students who were so verbal would clearly understand what goes together and what doesn't, because that's a pretty early developing skill. So if you don't know this belongs with this, but this thing doesn't fit in, then writing is going to be very disjointed. Formulaic writing, meaning it's writing to a formula. Here's a recent submission by a 3rd grader that I know. I like spring. Spring is nice. Spring has weather. Spring has baseball. I like spring. How about that? Not a particularly great submission to a 3rd grade teacher. And so I was talking this over with the student, and I said, you know, this is more like a list, almost a shopping list. And he said, you know, you're absolutely right. That's it. That is it. I have very listy writing. And I said, we're going to work on that. We can change the list up so it sounds better and is more readable and is more interesting to your audience. Writing requires the simultaneous integration of skills, all of these in executive functioning. This is difficult for many students with learning differences. So it requires all of these executive functioning capacities, as well as creating ideas. Think about syntax, grammar, punctuation, capitalization. All of those things have to be integrated at the same time, and it's very difficult. So let's go back to kind of that notion of writing to learn. What were some of the research effective practices? Using graphic organizers. I hear you saying, uh-oh, aren't those kind of visual processing based and fine motor based? How are we going to get those to work for students? I'll show you an example in a moment. Compare and contrast. That's a good way to solidify saliency determination. What's important, what to leave in, what to leave out. I'll talk just for a moment about the 4-square writing method, my actual favorite method for coaxing writers who don't want to write into writing pretty solid paragraphs. teach elaboration, teach summarization. There's a hard skill, and I will give you one example. And I've already said, think about categorization for your student. Well, it becomes surprising that students who learn to read, at least on a fairly rote level, the NVLD student usually comes in the first grades and second grades to be an adequate reader. There's a good fund of knowledge of words they can recognize automatically. They learn to decode or sound out words fairly readily, and in fact, sounding fairly fluent. So what happens when we move past rote kind of reading? In the grades, these are approximate grades. It could be third grade in your area. Third through fifth grades, there are difficulties in understanding character actions, motivations, perspectives. Oh, yes. In later grades, there's lots of difficulties with making summaries. They get lost in the details, and I said that something kind of unique that grabs them will seem to be trump everything else. So idiosyncratic interests can mar reading comprehension. And in the upper grades, difficulties with expository text, primarily because what's important, what to pay attention to. Our brain needs to know what to focus on. Everything can't be of equal weight. And also difficulties with note-taking. So let's look at the National Reading Panel. And here are the list of strategies that were found to be highly effective. And I'm only going to talk about the one that is in bold and give one technique. But on the slide here are more techniques married with each one of these activities. So comprehension monitoring is the ability to pay attention to whether you're understanding the text. Important skill. There are many readers that just read along and read through things and don't really pay attention to whether they're understanding. So there is one technique, very playful and fun, which is called click and clunk. And it comes from a suite of techniques, which is called collaborative strategic reading. Click and clunk is where usually the teacher or ed therapist models what it is like to think aloud. You say click as you're actually reading aloud when something connects to prior knowledge, to something you've learned before, to something you've learned in your own worldview and experiences, perhaps on a field trip. So you read along, click. Oh, that reminds me of the science experiment I did last year. Click. This is, oh, I heard somebody on the Weather Channel talking about, how they can make maps about predicting rainfall patterns. We care about that in California. And you say clunk when something is not understood. Most students go right past the clunks. They skip over the words they don't know, and they don't go back and do something when they don't understand. So they're not really comprehension monitoring. So this exercise of click and clunk is modeled, and then the student practices it. And you practice this for a while. I'm flying over the top of these techniques, but you practice these for a while. I tell my students that a clunk is like a speed bump. What's a speed bump? A speed bump is in the road. Why is it there? It's to slow you down. You're coming into a neighborhood, a residential neighborhood. At my university, you're coming into the parking lot that has lots of different sort of directions and lots of cars in the parking lot. So you hit a speed bump. A speed bump tells you to stop and do something about not understanding. So let's talk about some other kinds of cross-training, some of the techniques that will support thinking skills needed in language arts, both reading and writing. So here's a lovely list, and the page numbers refer to pages in the book. But I will just go to number 4, get the gist. Get the gist is also a collaborative strategic part of that suite of resources and strategies. Get the gist sounds simple and is really a complicated task and a fun one, a challenging one. Get the gist. The person who is supporting the student needs to find a passage that has a beginning and an end, so that's really kind of contained. It could be a part of a text, it could be part of a novel, but pick something that has a stop and a starting point. Stop and start backwards. Oh, well. Anyway, and then you write a summary, or you can give an oral summary for some students, that'd be better. And I describe, get the gist. You summarize in 11 words what that whole text was about, that chunk was about. 11 words, not more, not less. There's been copious amounts of research about this. 11 words is the magic number. And you would share out what you've done and what the student has done. If you're in a larger setting, what other students have done, and you'll kind of play with those and negotiate. Get the gist is a summarization technique that takes some practice. So I'm going to talk about how I move students into using graphic organizers of different sorts. And as I said before, I use physical models. I spend a little while with those. So actually, in order to do the traditional compare and contrast T, I actually, can you see this? I actually have an architectural T model. And you'll see in the next slide, I use this because it clearly demarcates what's on one side, what's on the other. There's a giant spine down the middle. I use sticky notes that can be easily rearranged for the students' responses, and I create initially the points of comparison, and I use contrasting text. Here's an example of one. The Golden Slipper is actually a Cinderella story. Cinderella stories have been around since 800 AD. The first written one was in China, and the one I'm most familiar with and was taught as a child is the Western one, which comes from France and harks back to the 1700s. So here we're going to contrast something familiar, the Cinderella story, with something unfamiliar, which is the Indonesian version of the Cinderella story. And here's my T-square, and here are the categories. And on one side it says France, and the other side it says Indonesia, and I've created the categories. Once a student has been able to contrast those, and we do this many times, not just with this story, but other stories, we move to the paper version. Do you see how I'm going through that abstract continuum? Do you see how I'm moving from the concrete to the more abstract? And so here it is, France versus Indonesia laid out, and here are the categories. You know the ones on the left, the fairy godmother, but maybe you don't know in Indonesia there's a magic crocodile, rather like that. There's not a ball gown anymore, there's a gold sarong, there's a straw sandal, the rooster is the timekeeper, and the romantic partner, not the prince, no, 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 it is the headman's son. Let's talk briefly about perspective taking. I usually begin by taking a large object and looking at it from different perspectives. See, I'm using a 3D model again. In my office, I have a really large stuffed animal that's a wonderful lion with a mane. And you can see that if I look at him face on, we're going to describe the mane. And then I have the student look at him from the back side, and it looks completely different from the bottom side, from the top side only, from the side. And a student would then bring in some other objects, and we would do this for a while, describing from different points of view, just to bring home with physical objects that things can look different from different perspectives. And then I use commonly known books or stories. And here's some examples. The True Story of the Three Little Pigs. I'll do a little brief overview. If you don't know, that's a lovely story. George versus George. I'll talk about that in a moment. And Parallel Journeys. These are actually in sequence of ages that it would be appropriate. Parallel Journeys, I don't have a slide for, but it's a wonderful story of two boys in the same city in the same period of time. One happens to be a Nazi youth, and the other is a Jewish boy. And it's a wonderful contrast. The Three Little Pigs. This is a true story, in case you didn't know it. Everyone knows about the story of the Three Little Pigs, or at least they think they do, but I'll let you in on a little secret. Nobody knows the real story because no one has ever heard my side of the story. It's told from the wolf's perspective, and this is a great fun story. I bet you didn't know that the straw house, that was a complete accident. It was a sneezing attack, not an attack on the pig directly. George versus George is a lovely, more sophisticated piece of history. This is actually the American Revolution as seen through actual documented and annotated letters and written speeches. Anyway, it's George Washington versus King George of England, describing the same events and how it felt from different sides of the pond. The four-square writing method is my favorite of all time writing method to encourage reluctant writers to write and to get them to write more sophisticated narratives and pieces of whole paragraphs. You can find this book still in publication, but you can also find, unfortunately or fortunately, you can go online and find most districts and teachers from 4th grade through 8th grade have published the entire sequence of how to teach using this method. It's very commonly available. And what you do is you start in the middle, and actually you would just start with an idea. I would start with a topic, and then in one quadrant, the first quadrant to the left, you would talk about an idea, the second quadrant, another idea, related hopefully, the third quadrant, another idea, and finally a final idea or a feeling. So then you go back at the next level and you say, let's turn your idea into a sentence. That becomes the topic sentence. Then let's flesh out that idea into a sentence. We go sentence, 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 and then we do something even more powerful. We start teaching transition words, which lead the reader through your writing. So even simple text starts to sound more sophisticated. It would go something like this: topic sentence first, and then the sentence, next, and then the sentence, then, and then the sentence, and lastly, or finally. And you could get even more sophisticated by saying first, secondly, thirdly, in conclusion. Wonderful stuff. So how do I do this? I actually go back to a physical model again. I use a bento box, and I'm going to show you mine. A bento box is a Japanese lunch box. And here's my bento box. It's a little better than that picture, perhaps. And we begin by having the topic right across here. And then the next thing, we start saying, what's your first idea that relates to this topic? Let's put it in there. Do you have another idea? Great, let's put it in there. Oh, am I doing this? Yes, I am. Okay, and here, great, we got another idea there. Here, oh no, maybe it goes up here, I don't know, maybe this belongs down, maybe this is out of order, we can rearrange them, and the ideas go in the box. The box are a 3D version of the four-square writing method, right? And for me, what's also important is its idea containment. Only the things that belong fit in there. We can always take out an idiosyncratic idea and park it over here. And we have to respect that that's a really, oh, sorry, you can't see me, that's a really wonderful idea. It's very juicy in some way to the student. And so you need to safeguard them. I actually have a special place where we can go revisit those ideas and make perhaps a whole paragraph about this. So moving from the bento box to the four-square writing method, you can actually build out each quadrant so that it becomes a paragraph. And paragraph to paragraph to paragraph to paragraph. And suddenly, without too much work, you can build to a 3-paragraph essay, a 5-paragraph essay. Don't move too quickly, but use this technique. I also use technology tools with great success, things like speech-to-text, audiobooks, especially for textbooks, and for note-taking, LifeScribe, the Smart Pen. I'm hoping that this was helpful, clearly a flyover. Be glad to answer your questions here through the Q&A, or also by reaching out to me at marshall@holynames.hnu.edu, my university. Thank you for your time and attention. Thank you, Nan, for all your support. And guess what? Here comes Dianne to take us further along the continuum in ages, and she'll talk about math.
Okay, we're now ready to talk about mathematics. We're talking about strategies for successful outcomes. And I really just want to quickly make the point that the strategies that we're using here do help all students, I think. I think they're just good teaching. They're especially critical for the students with NVLD. If we don't employ some of these, they will miss important points. But if our classroom teacher, the things that we're talking about will benefit all your class. And I want to start out, as Marion did, with one student that was particularly meaningful to me, because he came to me as a 9th grader, just finished the 9th grade, and he said, I got a D- in algebra. And it was a gift, a total gift. I should have had an F, but the teacher didn't want to fail me because I worked so hard. Well, what am I going to do now? How will I go on to geometry, which I really hate even more? Well, that was a good question. It was going to be tough, but he said, I'm a hardworking student and I do well in my other subjects. Why is math so hard? And then I wanted to throw in this, one of my favorite cartoons. This is Hell's Library, story problems, more story problems, advanced story problems. That's how a lot of students with NVLD view mathematics. It's just, that's what you put in Hell's Library. And why is math so hard for students with the nonverbal learning disorder? Well, I think as Marion has touched on, there's some real problems with visual spatial. The perceptions aren't just really accurate. They have trouble with spatial relationships and sort of limited visual recall. Obviously, if it's not going in, accurately, the perception isn't in correctly, it's a little fuzzy, a little vague, it's going to be hard to pull it out. Now, it seems to me we've always talked about what would an inaccurate visual perception be? Well, this is a 9th grade student that I had, and this is a test of the visual motor integration. I think many of you will be familiar with it, and if you're not, the task is to look at the drawing on the top and then draw it. No time limit. The only rules are that you can't move around your test booklet and you don't get to erase. So this is the last page in the test. And my student was drawing away and she came to the cube and she went, oh good, cube, I know cube. So she drew her cube and she was a little disappointed in the cube. She knows that she had drawn better cubes, but you couldn't erase, so she went on. So she drew the middle drawing there. Now after drawing that one, she goes, oh, well that was a nice easy one. So that is her perception of the drawing. And she's pretty happy with it. And then she goes on to the last drawing. Now we finished up the test and we concluded. So I asked her, I'm just wondering, is there a reason that you didn't draw any of the overlaps or underlaps of that last figure? And she looked at it and she went, oh, there are overlaps. I mean, she just hadn't noticed them. So this is an example of how a student with some visual spatial difficulties views some of these figures, which I think you can see some of the implications for mathematics. It's going to make some things very hard. This student had pretty good motor too. I mean, she had neat handwriting, but the integration of the two and the visual perception was difficult. And by the way, for you educational therapists, I used to try to explain this a lot when I would go to conferences with the parents and the student and the teachers. And I always had the feeling that I wasn't communicating very well and that teachers were looking at me saying, what? Where, when I just took this, of course with the student's permission, and I just put this out there, and then the teachers would go, oh, I see what you mean. So I think it's a good example. Sometimes it's just better to show instead of tell. Just bring this along. Another difficulty with students with NVLD is the difficulty between whole and part. They don't get the whole so much. They see all those trees and they can't find the forest. And of course, there are a lot of mathematics concepts that relate whole to part. So those will be problematic. Another difficulty would be poor spacing and alignment. They tend to have, when they have to write the problems, they sort of drift all over the page. So if you don't have your columns of ones and tens and hundreds lined up, your answers will be wrong. And by the way, for parents, I think sometimes in the 4th, 5th, 6th grades, if they have to do a lot of copying from the board, copying from the textbook, I think if the parent has time, sometimes you write all the problems, let them just solve them, because some of the motor components are so exhausting. So if a parent can do that, sometimes that's a very workable solution to just get through enough of the problems where we're learning the concept and not being exhausted by the motor tasks. These students also have trouble with inaccurate skills for measurement. They don't line things up properly, so the measurements aren't going to come out right. Poor concept of time, a lot of difficulty on a clock, the traditional clock. Even high school students will say, I never really learned how to tell time on those kind of clocks. Hard time with direction, right, left, so forth. sometimes there's a difficulty with this visual overwhelm, as Marion was talking about. They just look at this a drawing like this, and it's like, where is angle OSC? And this drawing is better than some because at least they put the base color kind of color coded, but sometimes they just are so overwhelmed with the visual details, or even sometimes the decorations. They can't find the problem or the important part. So if those are the difficulties, let's look at it from another way. What does it take to be successful in math? Really, for anyone? Well, oops. Okay, I don't know how to go backward now. Okay. I'll try this. Okay, here we go. Oops. Okay, what does it take to be successful? Well, here's the components that I think are real important for math competency. And I would love to talk about all of them, but luckily for you, I'm only going to pick a few since you didn't sign up for a long video today. And I'm going to start with math vocabulary. And why start with math vocabulary? Because I really think that learning core vocabulary is a vital skill, but we often overlook it, particularly in mathematics. And it's a strength for students with NVLD, so let's lead with it. Let's start with the things that you're good at. Now, what's really important, I think, really for vocabulary, in any vocabulary, but particularly mathematics, is you must get the term, the word, the definition, and the precise mental image that goes with the term. Now, the parts that will go well for the student with NVLD are the term and the definition. They're good at that. It's this imagery thing that we have trouble with. And by imagery, I mean the process of forming mental images or mental constructs for sights, sounds, smells, words, concepts. This kind of imagery is tough, certain parts of it for these students. Now, if you want to think about it, there are probably things that you form images very well, and you remember those things. You may be a person that remembers visual landmarks well, or you remember spelling words well, but other parts are a little fuzzy for you. And that's how it is for these students. The kind of math that we often want, in the concepts we want, are hard. For example, a student with NVLD will be able to really readily say, yes, the product is the answer to a multiplication problem. But then they'll look at a question that says, find the product of 2 and 6, and they'll say, what am I supposed to do? Add? It just, the clue, the word product didn't really clue them that it should be multiplication. Those kind of applications and connections are not easy. Here's a more advanced example of the same point. One of my students could give this exact, precise, verbal definition of what are alternate exterior angles, and she could say it perfectly. You know, the created word transversal crosses two, usually parallel lines. But then she couldn't find them in the drawing. Those words, what are outside the parallel lines? What's opposite that crossing transversal? She just couldn't find them. That was very hard for her geometry teacher to understand, because his strengths were just the opposite. Because I couldn't have given a definition as well as she could have, but I could have found the angles. So that's what we need to be aware of, and how we need to instruct just a little bit differently for these students. We need to know they will often have kind of a rote definition. The term doesn't have image for them. They'll be a little overly literal or narrow. For example, one of my clients thought that there was only one diameter in a circle. That's because that's how I drew it, and that's what he thought. There's only one. So we have to keep making sure that the definitions aren't too narrow. And they often confuse them. Radius, which one was that? That's the one halfway across, the one all the way across. So we have to make sure that we're linking term, definition, image with particular emphasis on image. And one way that I worked on this really, I think very effectively, is to use what we call picture notes. And they're quick sketches drawn on 3x5 cards. You put the term or an example on one side, and a drawing on one side, word on the other. I just clip them on a ring, and then I put them in a binder so I don't lose them. Now here's an example. The front there, it would be the problem. 10 minus 4 equals 6, and I've highlighted the 6. And I would say, what do we call the answer to a subtraction problem? On the back of the card would be the word difference. Here's another one. And I'd be saying, what do we call the answer to multiplication? You know, answer product. And I'd also and this would include factor product because we often don't have the word factor, it's a confusing term. Here'd be quotient, and I've written the problem 3 ways just to demonstrate to the student that that's really the same problem, written 3 different ways, because they will have a tendency to see that as 3 different problems, inequalities. So I would often start with, if I'm working as an educational therapist or I'm working with a student one-on-one, we review these almost every single time at the beginning of each one. And then sometimes I'd show them the picture and ask them for the term. Sometimes I'd give them the term and I'd ask them to draw it. And the one reason I do this is it will kind of give you a definition so that we can look for inaccuracies. For example, I asked a student to draw an acute angle, and she was very good. What is an acute angle? It's an angle less than 90 degrees. So she draws a drawing on the left there. And I said, looks sort of like 90 degrees to me. Could you make the angle smaller? There's her second drawing. I asked for a smaller angle, and I got one, according to her. She made the side lengths smaller. She didn't really decrease the angle. So that would tell me that she doesn't really have the concept of the angle, and I need to reteach that to really tone that up and really get it more accurate. So math vocabulary is very important, I think. And I was thinking of one other student who wasn't too convinced that this math vocabulary was going to pay out, but he went along with me because he's willing to try anything. And he said at the end, you know, this vocabulary thing does work. For the first time, I can follow my teacher. Before she'd start talking, and after a while, I just couldn't stay with her. Now I can stay with her. And I think that when you have the vocabulary, you can receive the classroom instruction so much better. Well, another area would be procedural skills. And by that, I would mean the calculation skills. How do you multiply 2 digits by 2 digits? How do you perform various calculations for math? Very sequential, can be a little difficult. Well, one way that we found for this is to write down some, we're calling them scripts. You can call them other things, but they're just sets of directions for a procedure. I just put them on a 4x6 card, put them in a small photo album, and actually you've got your little picture there. The ones I use are even smaller. They're very not very thick, and you can just put them right into a binder. Here's some examples. How to multiply fractions. Multiply the top numbers, multiply the bottom numbers, reduce the answer. There's an example. Here's one on how to divide with exponents. I'm just putting several of these in because you can use them really for any level of mathematics. Here's how to find the slope of a line. And how would you know if it's a good script card? Well, here's a couple of components. I think you really need to have the title for the skill. How to multiply fractions, how to find slope. Sometimes you find that students actually know the skill, but they don't have a title on it. They can't tell you what skill they just did. So you want to make sure there's a title on it, because that's going to be one of the ways that they can pull it back out of memory without panicking. I know sometimes on a test, kids will go, oh, I don't know how to do that. And you just have to say, well, yeah, actually you were doing quite well yesterday. So these kids also, because they've had some negative experiences, will tend to have a sense of panic. And if we can keep that anxiety down, learning goes much better. Then a good script card would also have the steps necessary, some examples, and a drawing. And it really needs to be written in the student's words. And of course, I check it for accuracy. I'm not going to let a student go out of there with something that's inaccurate. But like the one example I showed you, it said top number. Well, of a fraction. Well, I'd be supplying, yes. And we called up the numerator. So we're trying to hone them in, but I'm making sure they're accurate. The key thing is when this individual looks at the script, can she remember how to do the skill? Do they go, oh, that's right. Now I remember it now. Then you know it's a good script card. And I think they're particularly beneficial because you don't have to, as the teacher or the ed therapist or the parent, you don't have to keep reteaching the same skills. You can say, oh yes, I think that's in your script book. Remember how to find slope? You know, you can look that up. And they can look it up, and I say it gives them more review, more practice, and more independence. They don't feel like, oh, I forgot that. I know we did it before and I can't remember. It gives them more confidence, more independence. So one of my other students, we were making a script book, and she said she people were noticing that she was doing much better in her algebra class. And she said, I think I could be mugged in the hallway for this book, which I got a big kick out of that. And obviously what we're trying to do is we start with the individual's language. We're trying to get them to standard English, and then we're getting them to the truly symbolic language of mathematics. That's our goal, to work our way through it. But we need to start where the student is. Now, can I write the script card for the student? Yes, I think that can work if the student really struggles with motor. But again, I have to make the point that I will be the scribe. It's your words, because that's forcing the student to really get words around the skill and help him translate that into his language so that he can remember it. Okay, another area that's very important with mathematics, obviously, is conceptual understanding. We don't want a student that just can do procedures but has no idea why he's doing them or when he might need to use them. And this is one where I think it's particularly important to teach students with nonverbal learning disorders the whole to the parts to the whole. Now, you'll notice in the literature that there's a lot of discussion on which is better, whole to parts, parts to whole. I think for these students, the best is really to start with the whole. As Marion was saying, this is really the clink. Let's connect it to something that you know. Let's get a sense of the whole. Since we know that the difficult area, then let's break it down and let's bring it back at the end. Now, when I say the whole, what am I talking about? What does that mean? This is like the overview, the big picture. What are we doing here? You know, we are finding slope. We are solving inequalities. You know, let's give that student the whole. We have to provide some sort of context. We have to relate it to the prior knowledge, which, if you'll notice, those are all just basic best practices. This is what we want to do for the student. Give them a real frame of reference. And one question I think is very helpful is, how will you know when you are done? What's the end product? How do we know that? I learned this one time when a student was working away on my whiteboard doing an algebra problem, doing it very well, but he just stopped. I said, so why'd you stop? He said, I thought I was done. I said, well, why did you think you were done? And he said, well, I've been working on it long enough. Well, unfortunately, you know, the length of time you've worked on the problem doesn't determine if you're done. But then we could really say to them, you know, in an algebra problem, you're usually done if you get down to variable equal sign number. So anytime for these students, even if they're writing tasks, what does a good end product look like? Create the clear target for the student and keep asking, do you see a pattern? Sometimes students tend to see all isolated events and not the pattern. And learning gets a lot better when you see patterns. So we start with the big picture, then we teach the steps, then we end with the whole again. Sum it up at the end, help them sum it up. And I think it's very helpful to have the student do the summary. It's not an easy skill, but so we're practicing the summary. And again, then I can hear if he has missed something or not learned it the way I think would be most helpful to him. Now, one more point before we close is that sometimes to have really good conceptual understanding, as Marion was saying, we need to drop back from the two-dimensional into the three-dimensional, because our students here are way better at the concrete level there. If you notice, we're using where it's three-dimensional. We often start at pictorial, particularly at the older ages, you know, third grade up. And what's difficult for students with NVLD a lot of times is, how does 3D look in 2D? Once they have that translation made, then they can readily go on to the symbolic and even the abstract. The real problem area is translating from what does 3D look like in 2. So here, well, I had one student who was just struggling with how to find total surface area. So I just brought in a real box and I compared it next to the drawing. Here's this side. Can you show me that side on the drawing? It was a breakthrough moment for the student. He goes, oh, now I get it. This is like the top and this is the bottom, the front and the back. And he goes, now I get it. Or I had another student who really didn't understand total surface area of a cylinder. He goes, I just don't understand. This thing's round. How can it be how come we're talking about a rectangle? Well, we took the oatmeal box and we cut it apart. And we flattened it out. There you go. When you flatten out a cylinder, you get 2 circles and that middle part comes out to be a rectangle. Again, an epiphany, and then they can move on readily. So these are some of the real components that I think are vitally important for math competency. And students that we have really can do well in math. They can move on to finish the math requirements to get into college. And if we don't let this be a stumbling point for them, the rest of their careers and life can go well. The student that I talked about with the D- and that it was a gift, has since finished a master's degree and is doing very well. But as long as he made it through high school geometry, he was doing well. So it has been quite a pleasure to share with you today. I've appreciated it so much. Here's some of the contact information. Marion is back on now too. I think that Nan will be coming on soon. I think we're very happy to answer questions that people might have had. Nan, do you have the questions?
Yes. Oh, go ahead, Marion.
Well, just so you know, there were some specific questions to some of my content that came from a single person, so I answered those online individually. But if there are group questions or ones that haven't been answered, go ahead, Nan.
Oh, okay. Actually, you guys have done such a fabulous job of presenting this information that it looks like we don't have very many questions. But Marion, I think it might be interesting for everybody if you wanted to answer those two.
Okay, all right. Well, one of the questions was, where do you find those reading techniques and how-tos? So I actually had to look it up for the viewer. I went on to my iPad while Diane was talking. So the source book for reading by Bill Honig is, there are two editions. The first edition, the source book for reading. The first edition covers K through 8th grade techniques, the second edition through high school. And there's also some lovely sections in there on second language acquisition, how to teach using techniques that are appropriate there. It's a lovely book. Maybe some of you know that Bill Honig, once upon a time, was the superintendent of schools for California. So I love the fact that he's gone on to be a scholar and keep thinking about education. Another question was, if your student has difficulties with executive functioning, should you start with a speech and language person or with an educational therapist? And I'll say what I answer, and then you can chime in too, Diane, please. Nan as well. I said there are many specialists that have training and background and support students with executive functioning difficulty. I think it's more important to find a good fit for your child rather than focus on the specific background or training of that individual. Would you add to that, anyone?
Oh, I would certainly agree. I think that one of our goals, I think, is to equip parents and teachers. And what part of that equipping is finding out, you look at the resources available for you in your community, what you can afford, and then have the confidence to choose what's best for your child. I think it really is often a good match. And as the research, more and more professionals are finding out about what executive functioning means and its implications. So again, I think it's whatever you find are the best resources in your community for your child.
And there's some more questions now, Nan, that you could address. But I also answered a question. It was where to find someone in the LA area. And I just said as a starting point, go to NVLD. Oh, I did the wrong thing. Go to AET Online. NVLD is in my head. AETonline.org, which is our national organization. And you can search by zip code. And you will find a list of ed therapists, professional level and above in your area. And their areas of specialty and the ages they serve are listed there. And that's a really great place to start.
Okay, and then we have one more question asking how you spell Honig.
Oh, Hoenig.
Okay, thank you. And I want to thank you both again so much. This has been a wonderful, wonderful presentation. We probably could have done a whole hour with each of you. And I have to say, Diane, I've used several of the techniques that you have presented today and also at the national conference in October. And they are wonderful, wonderful suggestions. They These are all outstanding suggestions for working with youngsters with these problems. And so along with several people who have put in the Q&A their thank yous, I join them, and just to remind the audience that we are delighted that you've been here with us today. We hope to see you again next time, and thank you all for attending.